All right. We're back again for our Wednesday evening Bible study, and we're looking at church history beyond the trail of blood. And this is a short history of Baptists in America. It is not possible to cover everything concerning the history of churches in America. It's going to be sort of skipping like the trail of blood does. So, by way of introduction, most works on church history in America will include a whole lot, much about Roger Williams. Many think that he pastored the First Baptist Church in America. Well, he was a pastor of a Baptist church. I'll have more to say about that in a little bit, but he was not the pastor of the First Baptist Church. All right. Again, that honor belongs to John Clark. However, since Roger Williams did play a large part in the freedom of worship in America, we will deal with him first before we consider John Clark. I've got some follow-up things from last week on him. Again, I'm utilizing a history of the Baptist in the United States by Albert Henry Newman, who was a professor of church history in McMaster University in Toronto, Canada. And this was written back in the late 1800s, 1894, I want to say. So anyway, but I want to look at Roger Williams again just a little bit. According to Dr. Newman, Roger Williams holds the honor of being the first in America to introduce believers' baptism and to organize the church on Baptist principles. It seems that Dr. Newman is leaning toward what was commonly believed about the First Baptist Church in America. Now, to his credit, he lists several sources to back up his belief concerning Roger Williams. But he does have some pretty strong things to say about that church in let's see, not Newport, but Providence. Thank you. Providence, Rhode Island. We know that just the opposite is true. John Clark pastored the First Baptist Church in America. Makes note, I'll make a statement right here, makes no difference if you believe that the church in Providence was started first rather than Newport. Makes no difference. And I'll tell you why when we get there. Whether during or shortly after the completion of his university course, he was led to adopt rigorous separatist principles. Now, I don't include this in your notes, but sometimes you're going to see, actually pretty frequently, you're going to see separatists and nonconformists being used interchangeably because they are the one and the same. Okay? So when you see nonconformist, that's the same thing. Yes. Yes. They're both one and the same. Okay, the England of 1630 was no place for nonconformists, and say that's one time that it's used that way. In December of that year, he set sail for New England, hoping there to be permitted to enjoy a measure of soul liberty denied him at home, and not without exception of being able to exert some wholesome influence on the development of the New World. And when you see P or PP and then numbers after it, I'm telling you where I found it in this source. Newman relates how that Williams was a much educated man, one that should have been offered positions at most of the high universities in England. Because of his beliefs, none of that ever happened. Shortly after his arrival in New England, he was offered the pastorate of a Boston church. Landed in New England in February 1631, an attractive opening almost immediately presented itself. The pastor of the Boston church was returning to England, and Williams was invited to supply his place. Did he accept the invitation? Far from it. The Boston church was an unseparated church, and he durst not officiate to it. In other words, it was a state church. We don't know what one, but Massachusetts, I don't know. Congregationalist was, yeah. Well, it had to be one of three anyway. It had to be either Presbyterian, Congregationalist, or Catholic. So he was prompted to give utterance while in Boston to a conviction formed, no doubt, long before. Familiar and commonplace now, startling and revolutionary then and there, that the magistrate may not punish any sort of, quote, breach of the first table, unquote, such as idolatry, Sabbath breaking, false worship, blasphemy, etc. And he had thus succeeded in convincing the leading men of the colony that he was an impracticable and dangerous man, all the more dangerous because of his splendid gifts and his unswerving loyalty of conscience. Yeah, many times we think of Roger Williams in a bad light, but actually, with the exception of him claiming to be a Baptist, he wasn't that bad of a man. His beliefs were probably not exactly Baptistic, but were close, yeah. But it just hang on a little bit. It was only what might have been expected when the Salem church a few months later invited him to be their teacher, that 6 of the leading men of Boston should have sent a joint letter of warning to Governor Endicott of Salem. That's Salem, Massachusetts. That's also the Salem where the witch trials were. so thus preventing him from settling at Salem. He betook himself to the older and more thoroughly separatist Plymouth colony, where he was cordially received and soon became associated as teacher with Ralph Smith, who was the pastor of the church. Here he remained about 2 years. According to Governor Bradford, that was the governor of Salem, his teaching was well approved, for the benefit whereof I still bless God, and am thankful to him even for his sharpest admonitions and reproofs, so far as they agreed with the truth. According to Brewster, elder of the church, toward the close of the period, Williams began to, quote-unquote, vent, quote-unquote, again, divers of his own singular opinions, and to seek to impose them upon others. Now he's becoming as bad as almost the rest of them. So, not finding such concurrence as he expected, he desired his dismission to the church of Salem, which, with considerate reluctance on the part of some, was granted. It is certain that the influential people of Boston were industriously fostering any spirit of dissatisfaction that may have arisen. In other words, they were probably behind. Yes. Excuse me. During his stay at Plymouth, he spent much time with the Indians. Now, we're not told what tribe this is. And succeeded in so far mastering their language as to be able to converse freely with them, and afterward to write the key into the language of America, which he hoped might prove an important aid in the evangelization of the natives of the entire continent. His friendship with the Indians was afterward of incalculable advantage, not only to himself, but to his fellow colonists. In August 1634, he was invited to succeed Skelton in the pastorate of the Salem church, having since his arrival served as assistant pastor. The Boston authorities remonstrated, and a struggle ensued that resulted in William's banishment in the midst of winter, January 1636. And we might not think much about that, but in that day and time, that was a life or death matter. Befriended by the Indians, after much hardship, he reached Narragansett Bay, where he secured land from the Indians and established a colony on the principle of absolute liberty of conscience. Absolute liberty of conscience. Another way of saying that is freedom of worship, or freedom to worship as you see fit. All right?
I think that's the same type of thing with management. I think that's how Dixon Island was colonized. Same type of
The controversy of Roger Williams with his Massachusetts authorities that led to his banishment and the literary controversy that was carried on between Williams and Cotton some years before or after the former had established a column in his own are matters of such importance in themselves. Now, the Cotton he's talking about is not Cotton Mather. It is John Cotton, who was a pastor of a Congregationalist church, and have been the occasion of so much partisan writing on the part of Baptists and the defenders of the standing order alike, that a clear statement of the facts here seems desirable. In other words, Newman is saying we need to clear these things up. It needs scarcely be said that the idea of liberty of conscience, though it had been advocated, as we have seen, by the anti-pedo-Baptists of the 16th century, and though it had been set forth with the utmost distinctness and emphasis by the General Baptists of England, excuse me, during the 20 years just preceding William's controversy with the New England authorities, had not dawned upon the minds of the men of Massachusetts Bay. If anybody felt impelled to teach or practice anything at variance with the teachings and practices of the standing order, the world was wide and there was room enough outside the jurisdiction of the company. Inside, he could not remain. In other words, if you're going to play our game, you're going to think like we do. The year after William's arrival in 1632, it was enacted that, quote, to the end that the body of the commons may be preserved of honest and good men, for the time to come, no man shall be admitted to the freedom of this body politic, but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the same. In other words, in order to be a member of the town or the city, or still a town at this point, of Plymouth, Salem, or what was the other one again? No. Boston would be one. Well, anyway, exclusion from a church meant loss of citizenship. And the general court was ready to execute ecclesiastical censures. In other words, if you were not a member of a state church in Massachusetts, you could not hold citizenship in that state, nor in any of the towns in the state.
So for the general populace, the cards were stacked against them, period.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have any rights to what court said or anything. That's
No.
how the Salem witch trials happened.
Yes. Yes. We can scarcely conceive of a more perfect equipment for the exercise of tyranny and the violation of conscience when that probably should be then existed in this small community, thus theocratically organized. That would probably be a better word. Sometimes it didn't come clear, the original printing. So that this theocratic legislation was not a dead letter on the statute book, we shall soon see. It must be admitted, on the other hand, that men of convictions and conscience are not always the most agreeable members of society. The man who concentrates his attention upon one or two matters that seem to the great body of his contemporaries of minor moment, and advocates his peculiar views in such a way as to cause division and to bring the community into bad repute, can scarcely expect to be cordially treated in any age or in any land. In other words, what Roger Williams did, he stirred up the hornet's nest. The man who is travailing in spirit with a great revolutionary idea is likely to do far less than justice to other ideas and to existing institutions, and to act without regard to immediate consequences. Roger Williams was a man of profound convictions on a particular class of subjects. To us, the importance of some of the matters upon which he fixed his attention is manifest, but we are forced to admit that he was often extreme and inconsiderate in the pressing of his convictions. It seems that he developed the attitude of, all right, it's either my way or the highway. Of course, that's the way that the officials in Massachusetts were, except Williams' way was different from their way. So they are saying, okay, our way or your highway. And, of course, Williams lost. The vast importance of the absolute separation of church and state, of complete separation from an apostate church, and of absolute liberty of conscience had completely mastered his soul, and considerations of expediency were as dust in the balance in comparison. You ought to read this book. I'll tell you, these fellows in the 1800s, in their writing, you talk about long sentences. One sentence is a paragraph. Pretty soon I'm sitting there and my eyes are going, I believe it. One sentence, yes. Yes. Newman is not the only one who writes this way. Almost everyone that I have read after in the 1800s write like this.
Also, be glad that our translators put the periods in the Bible.
Yeah.
Because it was the same way. It was just, especially in the Hebrew, there was no division.
That's right.
You had to figure that out.
Yeah. Okay, we can do him full honor for his consistent advocacy of these principles in season and out of season, without being unduly severe in our judgment of his opponents and persecutors. If we were forced to adopt a modern designation for him, writes Professor Mason, referring to Roger Williams, we should call him the father of all that has figured anywhere in Great Britain or in the United States or in the British colonies under the name of voluntarism. No, I know. Elsewhere, he designates himself as, quote, arch-individualist, unquote. If by father is to be understood originator the expression is far too strong. For as we have seen, the General Baptists of England were a score of years in advance of him in their advocacy of these very principles. And William's direct indebtedness to their pleas for liberty of conscience is indisputable. In other words, the General Baptist in England already had this concept down pat before Roger Williams ever came along. But if the expression be taken to mean that by his persistent and zealous advocacy of these views and by his successful embodying them in a civil constitution, he first brought them prominently before the English-speaking public and was instrumental in securing their wide acceptance. Newman says, we do not demur. We don't deny this. Yet, even in this matter, we should not forget that the honor must be divided with John Clark. Roger Williams advocated the most complete separation of church and state at a time when there was no historical example of such separation. Nay, when to the mass of Christian men everywhere, such a separation was almost inconceivable. It was unthinkable. Because for centuries, the church was the state, and the state was the church. We've seen that in the Trail of Blood. And so it went. Roger Williams, again, against the established hierarchy concerning the separation of church and state. Williams supposedly wrote over 1,000 pages concerning the evils of merging church and state. And I have to say, I have seen nowhere with anyone referring to that work that he had done. So, I draw the conclusion, since there's no reference in any history books that I've seen about Roger Williams writing this, then it was probably destroyed somewhere along the way.
That's what they would do.
Right. Right. And the history books. This merger made it to the point that magistrates and officials held sway over the church body also. Now here's where the rubber meets the road on this. For instance, if a member were to start skipping church attendance, he or she, either one, would be summoned to the magistrate for an accounting as to why church attendance was being ignored. Boy, would that go over like a lead balloon today. This is what was happening. The church didn't do anything about it. The civil authorities did. The church had no authority.
It didn't matter what the members said or anything.
Exactly. It didn't make any difference what the membership thought. So entwined was this church-state merger that if a member lost said church membership, that member would also lose citizenship in the state as well. That's pretty serious. Huh?
Talk about slavery.
Talk about slavery, yes. Williams and some 12 others who were so like-minded were banished from Massachusetts. Because of his friendship with the Indians, he was able to purchase some land from them. That would later be called Providence. Providence, Rhode Island. Williams himself wrote, "Having made covenant a peaceable neighborhood with all the Sachems and natives round about us, and having in a sense of God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, called the place Providence. I desired it might be for a shelter for persons distressed for conscience. I then, considering the condition of the divers of my distressed countrymen, communicated my said purchase to my loving friends." In short, he bought the place, and because he wanted to make it a refuge, he named it Providence. Just obtaining the land was only the beginning of the process to this independence. The first organization was in 1638. There had to be a charter granted by the English king for them to be an officially recognized colony. In 1640, another agreement was signed by 39 freemen. One of their statements was, quote, "We agree, as formerly hath been the liberties of this town, so still to hold forth liberty of conscience," unquote. In other words, they had the desire to retain the freedom of worship as they had pleased, as they had been practicing since 1638, but they were not yet legal. Thus, Roger Williams went to England to obtain a charter for the new colony. That was Providence. Later, in 1651, difficulties arose with them with a man named William Coddington, supported by the Massachusetts authorities. These difficulties caused Roger Williams to go back to England, but this time he was accompanied by none other than John Clark. It seems that part of these difficulties could be laid at the feet of Williams himself. Apologists, apologists, for the New England theocracy have attempted to show that even in Roger Williams' colony, the rights of conscience were not strictly guarded, and that penalties were inflicted for substantially the same classes of offenses as those for which Williams was banished. In other words, he became like his persecutors. Among the cases adduced to is that of Samuel Gorton, an antinomian, an anarchist. Get that antinomian in a minute. And withal, one of the most violent agitators and licentious defamers of the time. That Williams should have used his influence in favor of withholding from such a man the rights of citizenship is thought to be a virtual justification of his own banishment for agitating against the charter and the freeman's oath and for his revolutionary procedures at Salem. In other words, Roundabout fair play. This occurred in 1640. Still earlier, in 1638, Varens, a boisterous and desperate young man, was disfranchised at Providence for maltreating his wife and refusing to allow her to attend church services, thus interfering with her liberty of conscience. William's severe polemics against the Quakers and his denunciation of the book of one William Harris as teaching high treason are also cited as instances of inconsistency with his Massachusetts record, and as completely destroying his right to complain of the treatment he received in Massachusetts. A careful examination of the cases cited will show, it is believed, that the distinction between civil and religious offenses was ever carefully guarded by Roger Williams. He just didn't make a distinction between the two, as he said should be done. That was the key. All right. Next. At the same time, it must be admitted that when the responsibility rested upon him of dealing practically with disturbers of the peace who sought to make their religious convictions a pretext for ignoring civil regulations of thought to be essential to the well-being of the community, he felt the necessity of guarding against unwarranted and licentious applications of the doctrine of liberty of conscience. Whew. That's a mouthful. All right. Roger Williams and the First Baptist Church in America. And you know I got a question mark there. Okay. It remains to consider Roger Williams' relation to the Baptist. The great principle of absolute liberty of conscience, which Baptists have been almost alone in advocating since the early years of the Protestant Revolution, he adopted, wrought out in all its consequences, and embodied in the Constitution of the colony which he founded. The principle of separatism from the corrupt state and state churches seemed to him logically to involve the Baptist position. So here he is, not a Baptist, but he sees what Baptists are doing in relation to separation of church and state. He likes that idea, because I'm beginning to wonder if he doesn't like to be told what to do. He firmly believed that the prelactical Episcopal, Church of England was an apostate church. Now, we know the Church of England today here in America as Episcopalians. And that true believers should have no fellowship whatever with such a church. He repudiated with the utmost decision, ordinances administered by an apostate church, as well as its worship and teachings. He didn't like it. He insisted with vehemence on regenerate church membership. Regenerate. Yes.
Well, no, I scooted over here to see two negatives make a positive.
His repudiation of Church of England ordinances involved, from his point of view, the repudiation of the baptism that he and others had received in this communion. His insistence on regenerate membership involved the rejection of infant baptism. Having become convinced that these consequences were involved in his position, he was too faithful to his convictions not to go where logic led. Accordingly, about March 1919, 1639, yeah, that's 6 upside down. 1639, 2 years after his banishment, he repudiated the baptism he had received in infancy and was immersed by Ezekiel Holliman, who before he left Massachusetts had shown a strong inclination toward Baptist principles. Now, just because he had an inclination did not make him a Baptist. Williams then proceeded to baptize. Now, I want you to get this. Wrap your mind around this, okay? Williams then proceeded to baptize Holliman and 11 others. Thus was founded the First Baptist Church in the New World. Not so.
In that case, if you went right back out like yours.
That's right.
Pretty much.
It may be of interest to note that the organization of this First Baptist Church in America was only about 5 years later than that of the first particular Baptist church in England under the leadership of John Spilsbury. And that the introduction of immersion by Williams was 3 years in advance of its introduction among Baptists of England. Precisely what personal influence was brought to bear upon Roger Williams to lead him to take this step is uncertain. Winthrop attributes his anti-Pedo-Baptist views to the influence of Mrs. Scott, a sister of the Miss Ann Hutchison, the famous antinomian, you're right, antinomian agitator. It can scarcely be doubted that he was already familiar with Baptist principles as held by English Baptists, and his familiarity with the Dutch language would make it unreasonable to suppose that he was wholly ignorant of the Mennonites and their principles. Haven't we seen this before? A precedent was set for this type of thing back in England. Just because Holliman had leanings toward Baptist doctrine doesn't mean that he had scriptural baptism. We seem to be back to man taking the authority to begin a Baptist church without church authority. This means that this church at Providence did not have a scriptural beginning. Therefore, it is not the First Baptist Church in America. To my way of thinking, that's me, okay? To my way of thinking, it makes no difference if the church at Providence was the first. However, I don't believe it was, because it was not a scriptural assembly at the start. Williams had drawn a conclusion that the ordinances, especially baptism by immersion, had been lost and should be resumed. He failed to consider the fact that there were literally hundreds of churches that never lost the ordinance of baptism by immersion. His view was that state churches had lost the true ordinance of baptism by their sprinkling and pouring and their retaining infant baptism, pedobaptism. Had Roger Williams been acquainted with the results of the latest research in medieval history, he would probably not have been so absolutely sure that the ordinance had been lost, even upon the supposition that an apostolic succession is a condition of their valid continuance. But he was manifestly in error in making the validity of Christian ordinances to depend upon any ceremonial or personal qualification of the administrator, the heir of the Donatists in the early centuries, and of high churchmen, Episcopal and Baptist, in modern times. And now when Newman says modern times, he means in the 1800s. Not the 1900s or the 2000s. As in the case of many great and good men before, what's that puzzle look? Yeah. I said that. I said when Newman talks about modern times, he's talking about the 1800s, not 1900s and 2000s. That's what it was started out. All right. Yeah, I guess I better treat our producer a little kinder than that, because he could cut me off. But as in the case of many great and good men before and since Roger Williams' time, his church life was wrecked and his Christian usefulness greatly impaired by his efforts to interpret the prophetical and apocalyptic scriptures with reference to the events and movements of his own time, a procedure fraught with danger, invariably resulting in error and oftentimes ending in disaster. The history of the First Baptist Church of Providence after the withdrawal of Roger Williams is for some years involved in considerable obscurity. The original records have been lost, and some have sought to make it appear that for a time it ceased entirely to exist, and that the surviving organization is independent of the first. The chief interest involved in this contention has been the desire to give precedence to the First Baptist Church of Newport, founded in 1644 or earlier. Now in conclusion to part 2. In part 3, we will consider John Clark and the First Baptist Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Any questions, comments? All right.
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.